Hi, everyone. Welcome to Potluck Food Talks. Today, we have another micro episode of The Line. So, Phil, how was your time in Japan? You told me some crazy shit that happened over there.
Yeah, I spent about a year cooking in Japan. I had a really, really fantastic time and a really, really crazy time at the same time. I just left Europe for the first time, really. And I was working in a really, really fantastic restaurant, in a very famous restaurant in Europe. And after I had finished my season there, they asked me where I wanted to go. And they kind of linked me up with a restaurant I had been dreaming of in Japan, a very famous, very high-level restaurant, 3 Michelin stars in Tokyo. And I traveled there and spent a year there. And that restaurant it was like a completely different world. The things that happened inside of that restaurant were just a bit like out of a movie. I mean, the abuse in the kitchen was very frequent and very often. Chefs would get physically abused very, very frequently for very slight mistakes.
You told me a story once there was this chef de party beating the shit out of his commis in the changing rooms with the backside of a screwdriver or something like that.
Oh yeah. Um, that happened, and they try to keep it kind of like behind closed doors. So obviously the majority of the chefs in that restaurant were Japanese, right? And so I was the only chef working full time that was not Japanese. Apart from that, there were some international interns, sort of like 2 or 3 interns at a time, but I was the only chef who was not Japanese. So they did try and keep it sort of like behind closed doors, but the treatment between sort of management and the rest of the staff was very brutal. Very, very notably, there was this one guy who used to be a chef in the kitchen, and then he sort of fucked up and he got demoted. He got demoted to being like the house janitor and cooking star food. That was his job, cleaning the house and cooking star food because of a mistake that he made in the kitchen. I mean, this is the reality of like what it was like. There were a lot of people there who were chefs who went to the restaurant and said, "Oh, I want to work here. I want to cook here." And the guy was sort of like, "Well, if you want to cook here, then you'll have to do your time." And so they put you in service to serve tables. The guys were sort of like, "All right, I'll work front of house, I'll work service until there's a space open for me, because I have the dedication, I have the commitment. I really want to work here. It's such a legendary place." Skip to 2 years later, they're still in front of house. They're still working, but they're actually chefs. And they're still there, kind of like waiting tables, putting on a suit every day, waiting for their chance to get into the kitchen. It was absolutely insane.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely insane. And so they would come in the morning, do some like fish prep, and they would be really good. They'd be really, really talented chefs. And so they'd do some prep, but then they'd put on a suit and go in front of us. Absolutely crazy. One of them now is a Michelin star chef. When I arrived, he was there. He had been there for like a year and a half working in front of house service.
So I remember this story that was about a prize that the restaurant was supposed to get and didn't get. And that was like the most crazy night you had at that restaurant.
Yeah, that was one of you can't even call it a night because it kind of stretched over 2 and 3 days. And it was probably one of the craziest experiences I've had at a restaurant without comparison. So the restaurant was tough in itself to start with. I mean, you would work 6 days a week, and you would work from sort of 10 o'clock in the morning until 2, 3 o'clock at night, right? And so you were already used to a very hard environment. And to explain the situation a little bit, you have to explain a little bit about the chef. The chef and owner was this very famous, very imposing figure in Japan. He was a very well-known chef, huge guy, a lot of authority. And when he would walk through the kitchen, everybody else would shout, "Chef's passing, chef's passing." So you would like jump out of the way. So he would just kind of zoom past you. So everybody was very intimidated of this guy. He was a very, very imposing and very dominant, very sort of, how would you say? He had a lot of authority. Yeah. And so there, obviously there's this big award celebration of the world's 50 best restaurants. And he was part of it and traveled to London to receive the award. We were obviously, as a team, fully taking part of it. And after service, we kind of sat down and we live screened the whole thing. And while we were sitting there and having a beer together and kind of like watching this event, keeping up with international restaurant scenes, we realized that the restaurant was dropping a couple of places. It wasn't a lot. It was like on spot 30 something. I think it was like 32. And it dropped like 3 or 4 places. So it was like 35, 36. And I was sitting there and I didn't really think of it that much. But my Japanese colleagues were terrified. Right? We were sitting there and the restaurant gets announced, place 36. And everybody kind of went a little bit quiet and they were like, wow, okay, we're going to get a lot of shit when this guy gets back. And so everybody was kind of mentally getting prepared of him returning to Tokyo. And so he did. He returned. He came into the restaurant as he usually does. I mean, you have to give him credit. He was in the restaurant pretty much every single day. And everybody was shitting themselves, absolutely shitting themselves. And so he came in, said good morning, didn't say much else, and everybody just kept quiet. The day went on until about dinner service, when he suddenly disappeared and then reappeared about an hour later in the kitchen, tearing everybody apart, absolutely apart. So this guy waltzes in, just starts shouting in Japanese. Obviously, us sort of Western guys, super confused as to what's going on. It's not really an unusual thing to see this guy freaking out, but we were just kind of like, but it was definitely much more than it was usual. And then he kind of left, and I asked one of the sous chefs, I was sort of like, what's going on? And he told me, he was like, let's just call this chef Hattori Hanzo for the sake of not and he said, well, Hanzo-san is he's upset because nobody congratulated him on the 36th place. And so it kind of backfired, this like being scared of dropping places,
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really, really backfired. And he got so upset. I mean, maybe that was just kind of an excuse. It's not really super transparent. So you have to understand that the restaurant had 3 stories. The bottom, the like ground level, was the restaurant and the dining room. The first level was changing rooms and dry stores. And the top floor was offices and a sort of test kitchen and a communal area with like a big marble table where people would have, where we would have staff food. It was like a communal area. So we would often have to go from the first to the second to the third floor to get certain things. And chef disappeared, Hattori-san disappeared during service and just kind of went upstairs. And so the culture in Japan is such that you cannot leave before your superior, right? So like if the head chef is there, nobody leaves, right? If once the head chef leaves, the sous chefs kind of like finish up, they leave, then the chef de parties leave, then the commis leave, etc. But nobody leaves before their superior does. Okay, what does that mean? That means that if Hattori-san doesn't leave, nobody leaves. Doesn't matter what time it is, doesn't matter how long you've been there. So what Hattori-san decided to do is he decided to go into the third floor and get absolutely smashed on Dom Perignon.
Nice. Why not?
Yeah, why not? Of course, being very upset that nobody was congratulating him.
Yeah, he had to also to celebrate somehow that he got a good position on the list.
Exactly, he was the only one celebrating, no? But I remember I had to go into the third floor to get something. We had finished service. We had been there for, like 13, 14 hours already. And I went into the third room and Hattori-san was still there. And I just opened the door a little bit, and I heard him shouting. His head chef was there, and his secretary, his personal assistant, were there, kind of talking to him, trying to calm him down. But he was freaking out, and there was broken glass all over the floor. He was throwing empty champagne bottles against the wall. Right. So I straight away, I closed the door and I went back downstairs, and I went to the sous chef and I kind of told him what was going on. And he was sort of like, yeah, we have to see how the situation develops. Right. So what do you do? Service is done. You clean down everything, and you're finished. The kitchen is clean, but you can't go home. So what do? You just kind of clean all over. You find things to do. You clean the machinery with toothpicks, whatever. The sous chef goes up to see what the situation is like. He comes back down and he kind of rounds us up and he says, all right, so here's the situation. Chef Hattori is very drunk and he doesn't really know what time it is. So he wants to stay because he thinks that in a couple of hours it's service time. So that means nobody goes home. And so we stayed the whole night. Throughout the nights. And of course, you can't just sit down and not do anything. You have to stay busy. So we start doing mise en place, start preparing vegetables, whatever we had, start cleaning down again. And then the same thing happened. It kind of like it got through the night and it got to 10 o'clock in the morning. We were sort of like, we started to prep. And then Hattori-san comes in, wasted out of his mind. And kind of like stumbled into the kitchen, his assistant behind him, kind of like trying to keep him upright. And we were just sort of there prepping and then went back out. And the guy was sort of like, yeah, so I just spoke to him and he thinks it's 5 o'clock in the evening. So we can't really go home because he's expecting us to set up for service. So everybody pretend like you're getting ready for service. And we were like, man, you gotta be fucking kidding me. Like it's 11 o'clock in the morning. Right? And so you like build up your section like you're doing service. And then the guy comes in, does the rounds, and he like goes back into his office to drink some more champagne. You break everything down again. It was the most like, it was the hardest thing that I ever had to do in the kitchen because like it was one of the only times where I was really standing at my section, cutting something and like falling asleep while I was doing it.
That's insane, man.
Yeah, it was crazy. We were allowed to go home for 1 hour between like 5 and 6 o'clock in the evening. But then we had to do dinner service again.
You also told me something about the dishwasher those 3 days. Something about his hair, I remember.
Yeah, so this is actually the same guy that I told you about in the beginning, the guy who got demoted. So he was a dishwasher, janitor, staff meal chef. So the house being 3 stories tall, you know, there's a lot of janitor work to do. Like you have to keep it super, super clean. And with, you know, about 30, 40 people working in the restaurant, front of house included, you know, there's a lot of staff food to cook. And staff food there was always a big deal. It was always a hot meal, rice, miso soup, pickles, and like a salad. So it was like a full meal, you know. It's a lot to cook for one person. And it was always very, very nice. It often consisted of tuna sashimi with mustard sauce and like a flavored donabe rice and then like different flavored miso soups every day. It was really, really, very good. And so this guy was just kind of like trying to keep up, trying to please the chef de parties and the sous chefs. But they were very, very exacting. So this guy, he always got the blunt end of the stick. For like he would and you know he would cook staff meal and I would think that it was totally acceptable, but one of the sous chefs would find something unagreeable with it and would just kind of like calmly walk up to him and kind of pat him on the shoulder and direct him into the walk-in fridge and then would take him to the walk-in fridge and beat him up. I mean, just wail on him, you know. Like just kind of like start punching him and then kicking him to the ground and just start beating him. Because for some, you know, because in his opinion, the staff food wasn't good enough.
That's so insane, man.
Yeah, it was so violent there. Like it was really, really very violent, and it was so.
But there was a story you told me once that the guy got his hair cut.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that happened one time also, that he kind of came down into service and he had to like lend a hand with something, you know. He wasn't really supposed to be in the kitchen, but man, the guy was sort of like, you know, he kind of reminded me of Dobby from Harry Potter, you know, this like house elf that lives under the stairs. Like he wasn't supposed to be in the kitchen, but he kind of like came in. And then the guys were sort of like just kind of talking shit to him, you know, like just shouting at him. You know, obviously I didn't understand everything because it's in Japanese. But as I didn't understand later, you know, I saw him like a couple of hours later, and his hair was shaved. You know, he had sort of like medium length hair, and then suddenly his head was shaved, but like in a really bad way, like super patchy. And I said to him, I was sort of like, what happened to your hair? And he was like, oh, um, the sous chef, he didn't really like how my hair was looking, so he wanted to cut it. And I was like, so when did he cut it? And he was like, yeah, just at the restaurant. So the guy just like bent him over the sink and just shaved his head because he was calling him like, oh, you disgusting pig, like why is your hair so long? And like it gets crazier like with this guy. So he was so abused. He was there for like 2 or 3 years. He was so abused and so mistreated, and yet he kind of stuck around. And at one point, I moved in with him, and really super, super lovely guy, really, really, really nice guy, very mellow temperament. And I spoke to him at some point and I said to him, why don't you leave? Like, why don't you go somewhere else where people treat you better? And he said, it's not that easy. It's Japanese culture. I mean, you have to understand this guy doesn't really speak very much English. I don't speak very much Japanese. So he was like, yeah, it's not so easy. It's Japanese culture. I can't just leave. So what I then gathered was that you can't really quit, either because you lose face. Either you get kicked out, as in like somebody tells you you are done and you're out of here, no turning back, or you leave without saying anything. And so he got to that point where he was leaving without saying anything. He packed his bags and he told me, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to go back to, I think it was some province in Japan, Nabe or something. And I said to him, good for you. I think this is the right decision. Like, get the fuck out of here. Like, really, you've done enough. And he packed his things. He left the apartment and he went to the train station. I went to work. The head chef and the sous chef were sort of like, where's this fucking guy? And called him. And what does he do? He picks up the phone. He gets shit on the phone and he comes back to work. Right? Any, like you and me, any sort of sane person would have said, I'm out of here. I'm already on the train. I'm just leaving. I've packed my things. I'm gone. But they talk to him on the phone. First of all, he picks up. Second of all, they give him so much shit on the phone that he just like hangs his head in shame and comes back to work.
That's so fucked up. That doesn't make any sense.
It didn't make any sense to me either. I said to him, I was like, why didn't you just leave? Go somewhere else where you're happy.
Do you remember this guy we talked about that was very good at cooking staff meal on the last episode? That also got a lot of shit. I remember that guy left without saying anything, but he left all his knives. He had I remember like a big knife wallet, like a knife, like a very big knife bag with a lot of utensils, a lot of high quality knives and tools and stuff, and he left it in the kitchen, so he had to come back for his stuff. And I remember, I think he was completely high on some stimulant, amphetamines or something, because he was completely like a berserker. He comes into the kitchen and takes all his stuff, all his knife things back into his thing to take it out. And luckily or unluckily, the chef wasn't there, because I think he was ready to kick the shit out of the chef, which makes sense in this kind of context, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Because while you're there, you feel like you're trapped in the system and you feel like you have to abandon yourself to this system of sort of like of this like little world that you're in, you know, where the chef is the god, right? And you like that's why you take so much abuse, because you're like, oh, this is what it is, and then you break out of that and you have to retaliate for so much that you've lived through.
Yeah, I went through some crazy abuse as well. Apart from the story we already told, nothing super extreme, but I mean these kinds of things when they go on and on and on, and you take shit day after day after day. I remember working in a restaurant that I was supposed to, my plan was to work there at least for 1 year and maybe build a career. And after 5 months, I remember every night I went home to sleep, I wanted to cry like for 5 months. And then it was a point like, okay, this doesn't make any sense. Why should I stay here? And it's as you say, you're there because you want to build like a career, you want to learn things, you want to have a nice CV where you worked in nice places, and you think you can take this kind of stuff for that price, but at some point enough is enough and you just leave, without giving explanations or whatever. I saw a guy once saying he was going to buy cigarettes. And he left everything and never came back. He left his knives and everything.
I mean, I've seen that a lot, and I mean, I've also experienced that. Especially the kitchen where you and I met, I feel like there were a lot of people that left on a bad note. I don't feel like anybody really finished their sort of like notice period. Like our sous chef, who we both respect a lot, Fritz, he left on a really bad note. He just walked out with one of the chef de parties, the main chef de parties.
Yeah, no, but that would happen on and on and on. Every once in a while, people would leave, or people would come super early to take knives and everything and leave without nobody noticing.
Exactly, yeah, all the time. And I mean, I remember when I left, because I handed in my notice, and I wanted to finish my time there well, because I did respect him a lot. And when I handed in my notice, he spoke to me and he was sort of like, oh, do you think this is the right decision? And he was kind of like, and I tried to talk to him about it like normally. And then after I did that, he just wailed on me every single day. And I mean, you have like a 4-week notice period. And I think after 2 weeks, I said to him, in service, he would do things like just to stitch me up. He would turn off my ovens. He would like dump my sauces into the sink. And
yeah, I remember he would do this kind of things. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, like I would put he would switch my sauces around, and like he would just stitch me up in service to then like give me shit. And I remember I turned around to him and I said to him, I was like, look, like, you want me to stay? You want me to cook service with you, or do you not? Because if you don't, then I'm just gonna leave. And he just didn't say anything to me. And I just packed my stuff and left.
You remember, well, in this kitchen, there was never a dishwasher because this was such a chaos, and dishwashing there was really hard. We all had to do it once in a while. There were this super expensive China collection with different sizes, and you had to do it properly to get everything and then polish the dishes and everything. So once in a while, like a person who works there just for a night. No, I remember this guy. He actually wrote like a motivation letter that he wanted to work there and grow there and blah, blah as a dishwasher.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I remember this guy.
Yeah, and the first night, he says something. What did he say? Okay, this doesn't make any sense having so many dishes. Why do you have so many different dishes? We're not in the Middle Ages anymore. And he was like, what? Stop, like the service music went like, whack. What did you just say? And he was like, I think you're an asshole, sir.
Yeah, I remember that. He was like, he was complaining about something, and the chef kind of like, he was kind of like happy about him being there, and then this guy started complaining, and the chef was sort of like starting to get like more and more upset, and then suddenly, and like he said something to him, he was sort of like, you just have to deal with it. And then this guy was sort of like, why do you have to be such an asshole? And everybody just went quiet, like, record scratch.
Yeah. And he was like, leave now. What? Now, leave. And he was like, what? I don't understand. And he walks into the dishwashing station, grabs the guy, and
Yeah.
and he takes him, like, there was a door in the kitchen that went direct to the street. And he says, door. Somebody, I think I myself opened the door. And he just threw the guy to the street in the middle of service, man.
Yeah, it was actually pretty hilarious, because like the way that it happened was just sort of like, this guy was sort of like, why do you have to be such an asshole? And everybody just kind of stopped, went quiet, and there was this like awkward moment of silence. And sort of like, wow, somebody called Chef an asshole. And he was just sort of like, went there, grabbed him by his jacket, just kind of like pulled him behind him without saying anything. And the guy was like, hey, what's up? No. And he was just like, door. Somebody opens the door and he's like, whoop, throws him out, door closes, and he goes back to service.
And service went on like normal.